The price of a photograph. Stop for a moment and look closely at this photograph. The man's name is Nsala. Before him is not an object, not a lifeless piece of evidence. It is the small hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, Boali. He isn't looking at the camera. He doesn't care about the person holding it. He is looking at what no father should ever have to witness. All that remains of the child he loved. This is not an abstract photo. This is a testimony, vivid proof of a crime, and from that moment, one family's private sorrow became a symbol of an entire nation's tragedy. But the most important question is, how could a moment of desperation in a small village in Central Africa become a mirror reflecting the dark truth of an entire era? To answer, we must return to the late 19th century, an era filled with great inventions, steamships connecting oceans, telegraph wires stretching across continents, and a euphoric belief that Europe held the key to human civilization. But behind this curtain of progress, an unprecedented crime was taking place. A king, hailed as a great humanitarian, turned a land 76 times the size of his own country into a private hell. A giant factory where human beings became raw materials and greed was elevated to a religion. This is the story of the Congo Free State, where the greed of a European king met the silence of the world, and together they created a nightmare that claimed the lives of millions. But it was also from that darkness that another light emerged, the voices of small but courageous individuals, those who dared to confront power and expose the truth. Part 1. The price of a photograph. An introduction from pain. This is not a work of art. This is not a staged composition. This is a historical artifact, a living piece of evidence of a crime the world at that time deliberately turned its back on. In Nsala's eyes, we see it all: helplessness, devastation, and a question that no words can answer. Why must a father endure this? That photograph, more than a century later, still makes us shudder. Because it tells the story not just of one family, but of an entire nation. A private pain became the symbol of a collective tragedy. From a private moment to a global testimony. In history, some moments are preserved not because the photographer sought art, but because the truth needed to be exposed. In 1904, Alice Seeley Harris, a young woman with a Kodak Brownie camera, still a new technology, dared to point her lens at what all of Europe did not want to see: the victims of Leopold II's regime in the Congo. Harris was not a politician, nor was she a general. She was just a missionary, yet she left the world a legacy greater than any speech. Her photographs, men with severed hands, children with empty eyes, devastated villages, became irrefutable evidence. We can read hundreds of pages of reports, but a single glance from Nsala is enough to comprehend a brutality that words cannot fully express. To understand the value of this photograph, we must return to the context of the late 19th century. At that time, the Western world was immersed in a belief in progress. Telegraphs connected continents, steamships cut through oceans, and European cities glowed with electric light. People prided themselves on humanity entering a golden age of civilization. But elsewhere, in the heart of Africa, that civilization wore the face of slaughter. In the so-called Congo Free State, a nation belonging not to its people but to one king, Leopold II of Belgium, millions of human beings were turned into labor tools, resources were drained, and an entire nation fell into a collective nightmare. Without photographs like Harris's, without gazes like Nsala's. It is very likely these crimes would have been buried in silence, leaving only a few vague lines in colonial archives. But history was recorded in blood, in tears, and through the lens of an ordinary woman. Today, when we look back, the photograph is not just evidence of the past. It is also a powerful reminder that the truth always finds a way to survive. In an era when propaganda could paint a king as a humanitarian, a single look from Nsala shattered that veil of lies. And this is what makes it a priceless legacy. It gives the nameless, the voiceless victims a place in history. It forces us, a century later, to remember his name, to speak his daughter's name, Bawali, a 5-year-old child who died simply because of the greed of a man thousands of miles away. The price of a photograph is this: it forces us to confront pain, not allowing us to look away. It turns private sorrow into collective memory, transforms silence into a voice, and makes an anonymous person a witness for all of humanity. But the photograph is only the beginning. Behind it lies a much larger story. The story of how a European king, in the name of civilization, turned a land into his private hell. And to understand that, we need to return to the context of an entire continent being torn apart. Africa in the late 19th century, the era of the so-called Scramble for Africa. Part 2. Europe in the late 19th century, the Age of Empire and the Scramble for Africa. To understand the tragedy in the Congo, we need to look at the broader global context. In the late 19th century, Europe entered a period known as the Age of Empire. It was an era of boundless faith in Western civilization, of new technological power, and also a time when political and economic greed reached its peak. When we look at a map from 1880, almost all of Africa was still in the hands of its native peoples. Only 10% of the continent was under European control. But in just 3 short decades, by 1914, that figure had risen to 90%. A continent with hundreds of ethnic groups and thousands of languages was almost completely divided and occupied. The Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885. The greatest testament to this period is the Berlin Conference. In the winter of 1884, in the German capital, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened representatives from 14 European powers, along with the United States. They did not invite a single African. In that lavish room, the delegates discussed not the fate of the African people, but how to redraw the continent's map. Borders were drawn with rulers on paper, cutting across mountains, forests and rivers, even splitting tribes in half, without any regard for the history, culture, or lives of the people there. The Berlin Conference is an unmissable historical milestone. It demonstrated the arrogance of empire. A continent of 200 million people was treated as invisible, turned into spoils in a global power struggle. The Euro-American perspective. But why was Africa seen as a delicious cake? First, there were economic ambitions. Europe had just gone through the Industrial Revolution, and that industrial machine needed raw materials: coal, copper, gold, rubber, ivory. And Africa was seen as an untapped treasure trove. Second was political prestige. In a century of rising young nations like Germany and Italy, acquiring colonies was a way to prove their strength on par with old empires like Britain and France. Third was the ideal of the civilizing mission civilizatrix. People convinced themselves that when they set foot in Africa, they were not only seeking gold and silver, but also bringing civilization, Christianity, and scientific progress. Behind these words, of course, was a cold machine of exploitation. The role of the United States, an unavoidable mark. In 1884, the United States government under President Chester A. Arthur was the first nation to recognize the International Association of the Congo, a front organization for Leopold II. This recognition became the legal card that paved the way for the Belgian king to achieve his goals in Berlin. With that act, the United States unwittingly laid the foundation for the legitimization of the Congo Free State. This is a bitter lesson in how a single diplomatic decision can help open the door to one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the century. Redrawing the map of humanity. The scramble for Africa did not just change the fate of Africa, it changed the entire history of the world. Those hasty borders, drawn in lavish meeting rooms in Europe, became a burden for the African people that has lasted for centuries. To this day, many conflicts, civil wars, and instabilities in Africa have their roots in the decisions made at the Berlin Conference. And it was in this whirlwind of partition that a minor king in Europe, Leopold II of Belgium, found an opportunity to turn his personal ambition into reality. As the French, Germans, and British vied for every piece of land, Leopold cleverly secured for himself a vast territory in the heart of the continent, a land 76 times the size of his own country, not to serve his nation, but to serve his own pocket. And so, from the lavish meeting rooms of Berlin, a vast piece of land was entrusted to a single man. An unprecedented event in history. A nation became private property. That was the beginning of the Congo Free State. And at the center of that story was a single figure, King Leopold II. Who was he? Why did a man praised as a humanitarian become the mastermind of one of humanity's greatest tragedies? Let us return to the life and ambition of that king. Part 3. Leopold II, a king with bottomless greed. In European history, some kings are remembered as heroes, others are celebrated as great builders. But there are also kings who left their mark with a bottomless greed that surpassed even their own era. King Leopold II of Belgium was such a figure. Childhood and the mindset of a dissatisfied king. Leopold was born in 1835 into a minor royal family. His father, King Leopold I, often called his son the little tyrant. His childhood lacked family affection and a close bond with his subjects. When he ascended the throne in 1865, Leopold II ruled only a small country, smaller than an American state. The young nation of Belgium, having gained independence from the Netherlands in 1830, had no colonies, no military might, and no international political influence. To Leopold, that throne was a cramped cage. He yearned for more. He wanted to stand on equal footing with Queen Victoria of Britain, with Napoleon III of France. But how could a small nation squeeze in among the giant empires? The answer for Leopold was a colony. Colonial ambition, an almost pathological obsession. Even as a prince, Leopold tried to buy old colonies from Spain and Portugal. He targeted the Philippines, then the island of Formosa, Taiwan, and even lands in the Caribbean. But all his attempts failed. He bitterly exclaimed, "There is really nothing left for us kings except money." This ambition was not purely political, it was deeply personal. Unlike Britain or France, Leopold did not think of expanding territory for his people. He dreamed of a colony as his private property, a private empire that he could rule and exploit at will. The mask of humanitarianism. a cunning deception. Leopold had no strong army to conquer, nor a vast treasury to bribe, but he had another weapon: words and clever deceit. He realized that the 19th century was an age where any conquest needed to be cloaked in humanitarianism. So, Leopold painted himself as a philanthropist, an opponent of the Arab slave trade, a bearer of the light of civilization to a dark land. In 1876, he convened the Brussels Geographic Conference, gathering explorers, scientists, and missionaries. In his opening speech, he declared, "To open to civilization, the only part of our globe which it has not yet penetrated, I dare say, is a crusade worthy of this century of progress." It sounded noble. But in reality, right after the conference, he established a series of front organizations: the International African Association, the Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo, and then the International Association of the Congo. Outwardly, they were scientific and humanitarian organizations, but in truth, they were shell companies serving his private ambitions, where he was both president and sole shareholder. Leopold's letters. Leopold's private letters exposed his true face. While publicly speaking of civilization and free trade, in letters to his associates, he wrote, "I do not want to miss a chance of getting us a slice of this magnificent African cake." Those words, today, have become precious historical evidence, stripping away the moral mask that Leopold had so skillfully worn. In a Europe drunk on the dream of empire, a minor king like Leopold II found a loophole. No need for a national flag, no need for a mighty expeditionary force, just diplomatic cunning and the ability to manipulate public opinion. Leopold paved the way for an unprecedented model, a colony belonging not to a nation, but to an individual. This made him a unique figure in history, a king who was both a head of state and the capitalist owner of a vast land. Leopold II, with his tall stature and majestic long beard, was often praised by Europeans as the builder king of Belgium. But behind the magnificent structures in Brussels, Antwerp, or Ostend, behind the splendid palaces, was a dark dream woven from the blood of millions of Africans. To make that dream a reality, he needed a hand to execute his will on the distant continent, and Leopold found that person in a famous figure of the era, the explorer Henry Morton Stanley, the man who found Livingstone. Stanley would become Leopold's extended arm in Africa, and from here, the tragedy of the Congo began to be written. Part 4. From humanitarian slogans to the rubber hell. In history, some slogans are recorded in books like oaths, but some are just masks. In the land named the Congo Free State, a king's humanitarian promises turned into a machine that crushed human beings. And the lubricant for that machine was rubber. From failing ivory to the white gold of the era. In the early years, Leopold's dream rested on ivory, but the market was volatile, transportation costs were enormous, and revenue couldn't cover the costs of polishing his image in Europe. The turning point came silently but fiercely in the early 1890s. The wheels of the era were turning. Bicycles became fashionable in Paris and London. Then came the automobile. The pneumatic tyre, a technological innovation associated with names like Dunlop, transformed rubber from an ordinary material into the lifeblood of modernity. In the humid rainforests of Central Africa, Landolphia vines twisted around tree trunks. This was the white gold Leopold had been waiting for, and from here, the slogan of civilizing was retired, making way for a new chapter: monopoly, heavy taxes, and forced labour. The decrees that decided human destiny. To turn the Congo's forests into a money-printing machine, Leopold didn't need armour, he needed paper. The decrees of 1891 to 1892 declared all so-called vacant land, meaning land without European-style deeds, to belong to the state. And the state here was him. With a simple definition, forests, rivers, animals, and even tree sap became his personal property. Next, he established a system of in-kind taxes. Villagers had to pay taxes with rubber, no wages, no choice, no way out. Concession companies like ABIR, Anglo-Belgian India Rubber, Anversoise and Kasai sprang up like capitalist fortresses, granted monopolies on purchasing, punishing, and telling their own stories to Europe. That is the evidentiary value we can still read today. Documents, ledgers, concession charters, legal papers that turned an entire nation into a forced labour force. Vines, sticky sap, and the human body. Wild rubber in the Congo did not flow in streams like the sap from hevea trees later in Southeast Asia. A man had to slash the vines, smear the sticky sap onto his own skin, wait for it to dry, and then scrape it off in patches, pulling out hair and skin, leaving bleeding blisters. When the vines near the village were exhausted, they were forced to walk for days, weeks into the deep forest, returning with trembling hands, and only enough to meet a fraction of the quota. In the reports of missionaries and independent observers, we can still find these trembling words. They returned at dusk, submitted the sap to the post, and then trudged on again. The weakest fell, and the next day's quota was not reduced. These are living testimonies, accounts, diaries, letters, irrefutable pieces of a system designed to consume human bodies. Tax by hostage. Women and children in the hostage pens. The rubber machine could only run smoothly if the men could not escape. So how to keep them there? By imprisoning their wives and children. Bamboo fences became hostage pens right next to the company posts. Whenever the quota was not met, women were starved, humiliated, and brutalized, and children were used as living debt ledgers. This was not an exception. It was policy. When we reread the reports, from William Shepherd's accounts in Kasai to the letters of British Baptist missionaries, we see a repeating pattern: hostage, quota, punishment. Village life shattered from its core as the family unit was deliberately broken. The shikot and the flow of blood. At the centre of this order was fear, and the tool for sowing fear was called the shikot, a whip made of dried hippopotamus hide, with edges as sharp as a razor blade. 20 lashes tore the skin, 50 lashes shredded the flesh, 100 lashes could kill. Sentences of 100 shikot became a unit of discipline. Even teenagers were not spared. Each lash not only cut into a man's back, but also severed the bond of trust between people, between villages, between today and tomorrow. Every bullet a hand. But the most gruesome symbol of the rubber hell was the severed hand. Ammunition was expensive. European officers feared that native soldiers would waste bullets hunting animals. So a rule was issued. Every bullet fired had to be accounted for with the right hand of the person shot. When the order met hunger, the horrific happened. To settle the accounts for bullets, soldiers shot animals for food, then cut off the hands of living people. A quiet trade in buying hands flourished. In a haunting record, missionary William Shepherd counted 81 hands being smoked over a fire, the inventory of a patrol unit. And then, returning to the photo of Nsala, looking at Boali's hand and foot, we understand, deep in our bones, that the accounting of violence was a real language that once existed. The flow of goods, from forest sap to European boulevards. History is not just blood and tears. History is also in the ledgers. At the port of Antwerp, shipping manifests showed ships from the Congo full of rubber and ivory, while ships to the Congo carried guns, bullets, chains, and military equipment. Activist E.D. Morel, an ordinary shipping clerk, read the truth where the numbers could not lie. This is not trade, this is a slave state. From the sap that had passed over so many bleeding backs, boulevards in Brussels were widened, palaces in Ostend were erected, and gardens bloomed before white stone facades, works that led Europe to call Leopold the Builder King. The historical value here lies not in the beauty of the marble, but in the moral question etched into every brick: what paid for all this splendor? When slogans return to their true meaning, Leopold once promised free trade. But trade in the Congo meant monopoly. He promised civilization, but civilization meant learning the language of the whip. He promised to fight the Arab slave trade, but the result was a state-run slave system of his own design. And that is the cognitive value that history forces us to retain. Political slogans have no intrinsic value. Evidence, documents, ledgers, photos, testimonies is what defines the truth. When Leopold's slogans are placed next to Alice Seeley Harris's photos, next to independent investigation reports, next to the Antwerp shipping manifests, the story tells itself in a voice that cannot be bent. People in the machine, names that must not be forgotten. History, in the end, is about names. Nsala and his daughter Boali, the unnamed mothers behind the hostage fences, the men who scraped rubber sap from their own bodies, the children who grew up with Chicot scars like a genealogy on their skin. When we call them by their names, we return moral agency to history. They are not just laborers, natives, statistical subjects. This is the historical value of memory. It rehumanizes those who were deliberately dehumanized by a system. But for the decrees to become reality, for the rubber quotas to turn into black sap in wooden barrels, Leopold needed an army. An army that wore the state's uniform but acted as capital's executioners, the Force Publique. Who were they? How were they recruited, trained and controlled so that an order in Brussels could become a severed hand in Kasai? We will step into that machine of terror in the next part to understand why hell could operate so smoothly. Part 5. The Force Publique, the Machine of Terror, Screen Shows, an old black and white photograph. A long line of black soldiers in uniform, rifles pointed to the sky. Among them are white officers with tall hats. Empty gazes, cold discipline. Small text reads, Force Publique, 1900. No machine can run on slogans alone. Leopold II's rubber hell was not built just from decrees and numbers. It needed a machine of flesh and blood, an army that turned orders from Brussels into whips, chains, and severed hands. That army bore the beautiful name Force Publique, the public force. But in reality, they did not protect the public. They were an instrument of terror, an armed wing created solely to ensure that rubber would flow from the jungles of the Congo to the ports of Antwerp. A unique army in history. Established in 1885, the Force Publique quickly became one of the largest colonial armies in Africa. By the early 20th century, they had over 19,000 native soldiers under the command of just a few hundred white officers, mostly Belgians, but also many mercenaries from Italy, Denmark, Sweden, and even America. This structure was unique. European officers gave orders, while native soldiers held the guns. And to ensure loyalty, Leopold and his associates did not hesitate to use violence and deceit. Children were kidnapped from tribes, raised in a military environment, and completely cut off from their communities to become blind instruments. Slaves bought from Arab traders were also conscripted, given uniforms, and handed guns, turning victims into oppressors of their own people. Hostages. The heart of the system of terror. What is most noteworthy is that the Force Publique did not just beat or shoot. They knew how to organize fear. When men were forced into the deep forests for rubber, their wives and children were held in hostage camps right next to the military posts. If the rubber quota was not met, the family would be starved, humiliated, or even killed. This was not a random measure. It was the strategic pillar of the entire system. In the reports of American and British missionaries, we see this detail repeated again and again. The man returns with his hands full of sap, but if the amount is not enough, his wife and child must pay the price. Here, we recognize a crucial historical value. Violence was aimed not just at the individual body, but at the social fabric, family, village, collective memory. It shattered the traditional structure of the Congolese people, leaving them with no foundation. The Chikot, the language of the whip. And then, the most terrifying tool for spreading fear, the Chikot, a whip made from hippopotamus hide, dried until its edges were as sharp as a razor blade. A sentence of 20 lashes meant bleeding. 50 lashes meant torn flesh. 100 lashes, a death sentence. In the memoir of a Swedish missionary, it is recorded, "We witnessed men collapsing after 50 shikot, but the officer just waved his hand and ordered, 'Continue,' until only a corpse was left on the ground." These are undeniable testimonies, manuscripts, diaries, consular reports, all engraving the image of a society where the whip replaced the language of law. But the most horrific policy had the appearance of administrative reason. Every bullet fired had to be accounted for with a severed right hand. European officers worried that soldiers would waste ammunition on hunting, so they decreed, "To get more ammunition, you must turn in hands." The result? An accounting of violence. Many soldiers shot animals for food, then cut off the hands of a living person to legitimize the bullet. In some places, an entire underground trade in human hands developed. Soldiers exchanged hands to avoid punishment. Missionary William Shepherd once described a scene he witnessed. 81 hands being smoked over a fire. Not a symbol, but the inventory of a Force Publique unit. And then, the image of Nsala holding the hand and foot of his daughter, that is the naked truth, born from a cold, bureaucratic policy. We need to place the Force Publique in the context of its time. Late 19th century Europe believed it was bringing law and order to Africa. But in reality, the law in the Congo was the whip, order was the hostage, and justice was a severed hand. The historical value here lies in this. The Force Publique shows the combination of industrial capitalism and colonial violence. A system that existed not just thanks to cruel individuals, but thanks to an administrative mechanism with ledgers, reports, quotas, and deployment orders, all designed to make violence a legal norm. In other words, this was not chaos, but the order of terror. The Force Publique not only ensured that rubber from the Congo's forests would reach Europe, It also ensured that fear would seep into the very marrow of the Congolese people, passed down from one generation to the next. And that is why, when we look at the Force Publique, we see clearly one of history's most bitter lessons. You don't need a large state. You don't need a giant empire. You just need a minor king who knows how to organize violence. And that is enough to turn an entire nation into slaves. But these crimes could not be hidden forever. As the violence spread, the first courageous voices began to emerge, those who dared to look, to write, and to denounce. In the next part, we will meet them, from George Washington Williams to William Shepard, Alice Seeley Harris, E.D. Morel, and Roger Casement. The people who turned truth into a weapon and launched the world's first human rights movement. Part 6. The Force Publique, the Machine of Terror. No system of exploitation can operate on slogans or decrees alone. To turn the Congo into a giant rubber-producing machine, Leopold II needed an absolute instrument of violence, an army that not only knew how to hold a gun, but also how to sow fear in every village, every home. That army was called the Force Publique, sounding like a public force, but in reality, they were the terror machine of a king. Established in 1885, the Force Publique grew rapidly, becoming one of the most numerous colonial forces in Africa. By the early 20th century, their numbers had reached 19,000 native soldiers, under the command of just a few hundred white officers, mostly Belgians, along with mercenaries from all over Europe and even America. They were not an army protecting a nation, nor police keeping order. The Force Publique existed for one purpose only: to force the Congolese to harvest rubber and obey Leopold's commands. To build this force, the administration kidnapped children, cut them off from their communities, raised them in a harsh military environment, and turned them into warriors who were strangers in their own homeland. Some soldiers were originally slaves bought from Arab traders, now wearing uniforms, holding guns, and inflicting pain on their own people. This was a double cruelty, turning victims into oppressors. The Force Publique had a special method to ensure rubber productivity: hostages. When men were pushed into the deep forest to collect sap, their wives and children were often held by soldiers in huts right next to the military posts. If the quota was not met, the hostages would suffer whipping, starvation, or even execution. An American missionary once recorded, "The man returns with his hands full of sap. But if it is not enough, he only hears the cries of his wife and child in the prison." Here we see the historical value clearly. Violence was aimed not just at the individual body, but at destroying the social bonds: family, village, community memory. It was the fear of losing loved ones that kept the entire nation in invisible chains. In the world of the Force Publique, the hippopotamus hide whip, the chicotte, was a language more powerful than any command. Just 20 lashes would tear the flesh, 50 lashes, and a person would collapse, 100 lashes, a death sentence. In the diary of a Swedish missionary, there is a passage: "We witnessed a man fall after 50 chicotte." The officer waved his hand. "Continue." And when they stopped, only a body remained on the ground. The chicotte was not just a punishment. It was a tool to sow fear into the very flesh and blood, turning violence into a daily ritual of power. But most horrifying of all was the rule that every bullet must be accompanied by a severed right hand. Fearing that soldiers would waste ammunition hunting animals, the officers ordered, "To receive more ammunition, you must turn in hands. The result: soldiers killed people to take their hands, or even cut off the hands of living victims. Missionary William Shepherd told of how he once saw 81 hands being smoked to be submitted as proof. And then, Alice Seeley Harris's photograph of the father, named Nsala, sitting beside the severed hand and foot of his small daughter, became irrefutable evidence. We call this management by hands, but it was in fact a form of violent accounting, where human life was reduced to a number, a voucher for each bullet. The Force Publique was not savage chaos. On the contrary, it was a calculated order, an administrative machine where the whip, the hostage, and the severed hand became legal tools to maintain production. And that is the bitter historical value. It shows the deadly combination of industrial capitalism and colonial violence. A system that existed not due to individual hatred, but thanks to procedures, reports, and ledgers, all of which turned crime into routine work. The Force Publique made the Congo rainforests silent, not because of peace, but because of fear. It ensured that rubber flowed to Europe, and that the people of the Congo were turned into shadows in their own homeland. But history never allows crimes to be hidden forever. And then, in that very darkness, the first lights were lit. The courageous voices of journalists, missionaries, and writers who dared to expose the truth. In the next part, we will meet them, the people who turned truth into a weapon, launching the movement. Part 7. The Demography of Death, a Continent Destroyed. There are numbers in history that, when read aloud, force us to pause because they are too large for the human heart to fully comprehend. The story of the Congo under the rule of Leopold II is one such case. In less than 25 years, from the late 19th to the early 20th century, the population of the Congo was cut in half. That is, from about 20 million people, only about 10 million remained. 10 million lives vanished from the map of humanity. And what is most terrifying is this: no cemetery is large enough to record that disappearance. Demographers, based on administrative reports, missionary records, and independent investigations, have tried to reconstruct the picture. Many villages were completely wiped out, to the point that their names were no longer passed down. The infant mortality rate rose to unprecedented highs because parents were exhausted from forced labor, or from starvation as crops were neglected. Tens of thousands were killed directly by the Force Publique, by the chicotte, by bullets, by severed hands. Millions more died indirectly from poverty, disease, and social collapse. A Swedish missionary once wrote, "I returned to a village after 2 years. Where there were once 300 people, now there are only 20. They told me, the others all died in the forest." Here, the numbers are no longer arithmetic. They become a human testament, evidence of one of the least mentioned genocides in modern history. Not all deaths came from the barrel of a gun. A large part came from the very social structures that were broken. Men were forced into the forest for rubber, leaving no one to plant rice, hunt, or tend to crops. Fields became desolate, and fishing villages along the river lost their laughter. Women and children were either held as hostages or abandoned in destitution. Epidemics spread: sleeping sickness, smallpox, dysentery. When a community is exhausted and has no resilience, disease becomes an invisible ally of the colonial regime. And then there was the silent death of the spirit. When a people is stripped of their beliefs, their songs, their rituals, their memory, they die slowly in silence. To better understand this demography of death, we must look at each face. It is the man named Nsala who lost his daughter because she was killed for her hand as proof. It is the women photographed by Alice Seeley Harris, their soulless eyes staring into space, as if their spirits had already left their bodies. It is the thousands of orphans who grew up in Force Publique barracks, becoming the armed oppressors of their own homeland. These are not just statistics, but individual stories, historical testimonies that force us to listen, because history, after all, is made up of the fates of specific individuals. We often speak of the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan massacre, but among these pages of history, Leopold II's Congo remains a blur. The historical value of this event lies here. It reminds humanity that genocide does not only happen in concentration camps, but can happen right under the guise of humanitarian slogans and commercial contracts. And that sometimes death does not require a crematorium. It can come from the silence of the international community, from the cold reports in a Brussels office, from the cargo-filled ships docking at Antwerp. Half the population of the Congo disappeared within a generation. Not just bodies, but entire languages, traditions, and collective memories were swept away. When we look at the number 10 million, let us remember that it is not a heartless calculation, but 10 million buried stories, 10 million songs that were never sung, 10 million futures that were never written. And from that, we understand. The value of history lies not in remembering how many statistics, but in the ability to hear the echo of the lost souls. Because as one historian said, when we forget them, that will be their second death. Part 8. The Voices of Conscience. Journalists, missionaries, and writers. In the middle of an ocean of silence, sometimes a single drop of truth is enough to create ripples. And in the story of the Congo, those drops were the voices of the press, of missionaries, and of literary authors, people who decided not to turn their backs on a human tragedy. If the demographic numbers made the world shudder, the photographs made the world open its eyes. Alice Seeley Harris, a British female missionary, along with her husband John Harris, captured shocking images. A father sitting helplessly before the severed hand and foot of his daughter, children with amputated hands, women emaciated from starvation. These photographs were brought back to Europe, shown in churches and lecture halls, and became weapons of conscience. In an era when photography was still a new medium, images had a power that surpassed any administrative report. It made it impossible for the public to say, "We did not know." Parallel to the images were words. The British and American press began to publish long-form investigative reports exposing the nature of the Congo Free State regime. Journalist Edmund Dean Morell, originally just a shipping clerk, noticed an anomaly. Ships from the Congo to Europe were filled with ivory and rubber, but the return ships carried only guns and chains. From that, he became one of the most powerful voices denouncing Leopold II, founding the Congo Reform Association. Missionary William Shepherd, an African-American, wrote down his first-hand experiences, describing villages being burned and children being killed. His accounts carried a special weight, as he was not just an observer, but someone who shared the pain of his fellow black people. Their pens turned the Congo, from a distant land, into a moral wound in the heart of Europe and America. But journalists and missionaries were not the only ones to speak out. Literature also joined the fight for justice. In 1899, Joseph Conrad published the novella Heart of Darkness. Although a work of fiction, It was based on Conrad's personal experience sailing on the Congo River. He depicted a world where human greed turned all ideals to ash, where darkness lay not only in the jungle, but also in the very heart of European civilization. Later, literature and art continued to echo these voices of denunciation, turning the Congo into one of the most horrific symbols of colonialism. Literature, with its endurance, took the story of the Congo beyond the newspaper columns and made it part of humanity's collective memory. What do we see from these voices? First, they are proof that history is never written by the powerful alone. Amid the darkness of violence, there are always small lights, from missionaries, reporters, writers, illuminating the truth. Second, they are a reminder. Historical evidence is not just castles, monuments, or official documents. Sometimes it is a trembling photograph, a newspaper article with blurred ink, or a novel filled with pain. Such evidence has the power to change public opinion, and from public opinion to change politics. Leopold II possessed a huge propaganda machine, but he could not control all the facts. And it was these voices of conscience, from anonymous missionaries to resilient journalists, from literary authors to photographers, that turned the Congo from a hidden sorrow into a global indictment. Because in human history, evil does not always win. There are always people who dare to stand up, to speak out, to remind the world. There are things about which we cannot be silent. Part 9. The Fall of the Private Hell. No dictatorship lasts forever. Even private hells must eventually fall. Because the truth, once exposed, has the power to erode the strongest walls of lies. And for the Congo, that process began with the very voices of conscience we have mentioned. By the early 20th century, Europe had changed. The press, human rights movements, missionaries, and civil society organizations had created an unprecedented wave of public opinion. The Times in London, the New York Times in America, and numerous other newspapers continuously reported on the horrific crimes in the Congo. Speeches, photographs, and novels like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness not only stirred emotions but also became political weapons. Governments could no longer ignore a humanitarian tragedy that had become a topic of discussion in every salon, parliament, and church in Europe. Leopold II, who had once styled himself a civilizer, was now gradually being unmasked. In Belgium, Parliament faced increasing pressure from the public and opposition parties. In 1904, an official commission of inquiry was sent to the Congo. Their report, when published, caused a shock. The accusations were not exaggerated, but were in fact milder than the reality. One witness recorded, "We saw not just exploitation, but systematic destruction, a killing machine in the name of profit." During this time, Edmund Dean Morel and the Congo Reform Association spread throughout Europe and America, transforming Leopold from a celebrated king into a symbol of insatiable greed and colonial cruelty. After years of resistance, Leopold II was forced to concede. In 1908, under pressure from public opinion and the European powers, he transferred the Congo from his personal property to the direct control of the Belgian state. The Congo Free State, the land promoted as a humanitarian dream, officially ended, to be replaced by the name Belgian Congo. Of course, this did not mean the oppression completely disappeared, but at least a horrific system of exploitation, where a king treated an entire continent as his private plantation, had collapsed. Leopold II died a year later, in 1909, alienated by the Belgian people. When his coffin passed through the streets of Brussels, the crowd did not mourn, but booed in protest. An unprecedented scene for a king. In retrospect, the fall of the private hell in the Congo is a significant milestone. It shows the power of public opinion, that the press, art, and voices of conscience can shake even a throne. It also reminds us that colonialism is not just about territory and resources, but also about painful human stories, recorded in every photograph, every book, every testimony. And finally, it leaves a lesson about the limits of power. Even a king in the shadows cannot hide crimes from the light of history forever. Leopold II's private hell had fallen, but the wounds the Congo had to bear remained. Lost villages, dispossessed generations, memories etched into human history. That collapse was not a complete ending, but the beginning of a long journey of struggle for justice and human dignity. And it is also a reminder for us today. No empire is eternal. Only truth and historical memory remain. Part 10. The Memory of the Congo and Lessons for the World Today. History always leaves a trace, not just in books or museums, but in the very way humanity views justice, power, and human dignity. The story of the Congo under Leopold II is not just the story of an African nation, but a mirror for all of humanity, reflecting bottomless greed and complicit silence, but also reflecting the power of memory and justice. Today, anyone who steps into human rights history exhibits in London, Brussels, or Washington can find the photographs taken by Alice Seeley Harris, a father looking at the severed hand of his child. That image is no longer mere documentation. It has become a silent witness that forces us to ask ourselves, will we confront the truth or turn away? In the Congo, small memorials, local museums, and the oral memories of the people still tell this story. The evidence, however small, still exists like a flickering lamp in the darkness of forgetting. The history of the Congo was not written only by its rulers, but also by those who dared to speak out. Edmund Dean Morel, the British journalist, turned his outrage into an international movement. George Washington Williams, an African American, wrote an open letter to King Leopold II, in which he accused, "This is not a work of enlightenment, but a crime against God and humanity." And it was the anonymous missionaries, the Congolese survivors, who told the story with their voices, songs, and tears. They are the ones who turned pain into collective memory, so that humanity today can listen. In the 21st century, as many European nations begin to remove or recontextualize statues of Leopold II, a debate has erupted. Should we keep these symbols of crime as a reminder, or should we remove them to soothe wounds? In the Congo, the people are still fighting for their story to be widely recognized, not just as a side chapter of colonial history, but as a global humanitarian disaster. This shows that memory is not the past. It is a present-day battle that determines how we define justice and dignity in the future. The story of the Congo leaves the world with lessons that are never old. That power without legal and moral limits leads to destruction. That the silence of the international community is a form of complicity. And that only when the truth is exposed does justice have a chance to sprout. These lessons still hold their value in the 21st century, in the context of war, resource exploitation, and injustice that still occur in many parts of the world.